right, we stopped at the first couple of verses of chapter 16 last week, in which we kind of saw more of the same, which we've had these two things that have happened at every point that we've had through this story. And we looked at the two possibilities last week. We began to look at the two plans for last week as well, as the Philistines are still finding ways, or trying to find a way to come up with, to get rid of Samson, because he has been a proverbial thorn in their flesh now for quite some time, has caused them all kinds of problems, killed lots and lots and lots of their men, left a path of destruction amongst the Philistines pretty much everywhere that he went. Now, we know, as we looked at this, that is, even though Samson has had an eye problem throughout this whole story, he's been very selfish, he's been very self-centered, he's not thought about God really any at all in any form or fashion. We've seen God, though, still use Samson to judge the Philistines for the atrocities that they had committed against them for a variety of years now, right? Which is a promise that was made way back in Joshua, that it's going to happen. If you come against the Israelites, God's going to revenge, right? God's chosen people, it's what's going to happen. Had Samson been like number one A+ saint, this probably would have happened in a different way, but it still would have happened, right? God, it's still God's sovereignty. It's still part of God's plan to use Samson to judge essentially the Philistines as the Israelites as well. It probably would have been maybe even a more amazing story to read. You think of all the things that Samson did because of the Spirit of the Lord, and he really wasn't following God. Can you imagine what Samson would have been able to accomplish had he been like the guy that was very faithful, and he was a very, very good judge and was following God and keeping to his Nazirite rules, and can imagine what he would have been able to do, right? But that's not the case. That's not the story here with Samson, as we have seen now for quite some time. And as we finish this up today, as we saw last week, the two plans kind of begins to set up here the last kind of the big crescendo here of this story, as this story begins to end, but also builds towards a major climax here in the narrative of what's going on. We saw in the first couple of verses, Samson is back in one of the Philistine cities. He went to Gaza, and of course, when he got down there about 30 miles from his home, we know that he visits this harlot. Now, we don't know if that was the purpose for Samson in going to Gaza, if he got sidetracked. I don't know what other reason he'd be rolling up into these Philistine cities who were the enemy to just, whatever, shop or eat or drink or whatever he was doing. But at some point here, obviously, he was visiting a harlot. And he, again, is indulging in his lust. He's indulging in his immorality. He is not being a very good Nazirite, right? He's not doing the things that he is supposed to be doing. And now, knowing Samson, of course, at this point, he's killed thousands of Philistines. He's done some pretty amazing things. Everybody knows, like, Samson rolls up into your town, you know who Samson is, right? So the Philistines know that he's there in Gaza. They see him come into the city, and they devise this plan, essentially, to capture him and get rid of him while he wanted to kill him in the morning, while he was done there in Gaza. Surprise attack. They had people posted up all these different places trying to pounce on Samson and kill him. And of course, as we saw in point B in verse number 3, Samson and God had different plans. Samson was awoken at midnight by God, I'm sure, right? Popped him up at midnight, and he decided he was going to come up with his own plan. And as we saw there in verse number 3, and we're going to read this again because I think it's just an amazing thing that took place. In verse number 3 of chapter 16, we see what Samson did to the Philistines who were trying to lay waste to him by capturing him in the morning. And it says, and Samson lay till midnight and arose at midnight and took the doors off the city and the two posts and went away with them and the bar and all, and put them upon his soldiers and carried them up to the top of the hill that is before Hebron. And we talked about this, right? These fortifications of these cities, the main front gate, only way in and out, right? That's how they kept things secure. These doors weren't like the doors, these double doors back here. These would have been heavy duty, thick wood infused with metal posts that were way down in the ground, huge hinges, and like this would have been as fortified as if you could. imagine you building the most fortified door you can possibly imagine. This is what this was, right? Samson just picks the old bad boy up, pops out of the ground, throws it on his shoulders, and just kind of walks up the hill, right? And we said that probably never even got a shot off at Samson, as they were probably too in shock to see this guy pick up this door and carry it out of here. And that was how pretty embarrassing for the Philistines, would have essentially left them defenseless to any outgoing enemy that wanted to come in until they had time to repair the door, which again wasn't a yesterday job. It would have taken quite some time, so it would have been very, very embarrassing. Pretty helpless that Samson was able just to come in and just tear down the defenses whenever he wanted to tear down the defenses. All right, and that brings us to verse number 4. Go ahead, Chad. You can bring us to point number 5 there. And now we have 2 pinnacles, okay? And now we enter our next major character here in the story, of course, Delilah. And we know this story very, very well. He falls in love once again. And now we are beginning to see the end of the story here. Now, the end of the story ends with 2 pinnacles, right? Or 2 climaxes in the story. Okay, you have 2 things it kind of builds to. And that's what we're going to look at today. Go ahead, one more time there. So verses 4 all the way down to verse 25, we are now going to begin to see the people in charge of the Philistine lords, mocking the destroyer here, okay? And as we read down through verse 25, we're going to see that mocking taking place. And then we will finish this by looking at Samson's lord destroying the mockers. Okay, so those are the 2 stories here that takes place. Now let's read verse number 4 just to start off with, and we'll begin to kind of tell, I guess, Samson's story, obviously very famous. This is probably the more famous portion of the story. And it came to pass, verse number 4, afterward, that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Okay, so Samson once again. So we see the beginning of Samson's story. He falls in love with a what? What race of woman, ethnicity of woman is she? Then in the beginning of the story, he marries a what? A Philistine woman, right? And we know what happened after that. Lots of bad stuff. We see Samson again, towards the end of his story, one more time, falling in love with a Philistine, right? Who should have Samson picked to be his companion? Not a Philistine, right? It should have been an Israelite, right? And if it had been an Israelite, then he wouldn't have had these problems, okay? But as we've seen now, the whole time we've done this, Samson is worried about Samson. That's all he really kind of cares about. So he falls in love again with another Philistine woman, Delilah, and he is obviously involved with her here over a period of time. Now, he never marries her, right? We never see anywhere in Scripture where Samson and Delilah are married, but this is an illicit love story that kind of places his weakness, his moral weakness, like it places his moral weakness in stark contrast with how spirit-endowed, physically strong he can be, right? So we're going to see his moral weakness comparative to how strong he can be physically when he has been, the Spirit of the Lord kind of comes over him, okay? So Samson and Delilah, of course, we know Samson's a very famous person. People know this. Falls in love with Delilah. Delilah is obviously fairly well connected, or at least fairly well known. Because as we move into verse number 5, we see that the lords here, right, of the 5 major cities, so the people who are in charge of these 5 major cities come to Delilah and have a question or a job for her to do, right? Verse 5. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and we will give thee every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. Okay, so the reason I say Delilah at least had to been somewhat well known, or at least somewhat, maybe not necessarily wealthy, but important or famous person in society is because, you've got 5 mayors here, right? 5 really important people, 5 senators, 5 presidents, however you want to describe them, like coming to her at her house and realizing, of course, she's obviously involved with Samson, but they have a job for her to come up with, okay? That they want her to figure out where his strength comes from, and if she's able to figure it out and then allow Samson to be killed or captured, they're each one going to give her, as you see at the end of verse number 4, 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, there are 5 cities. There are 5 governors. That means there would be 5,500 pieces of silver here, right? Which has been which have made Delilah very, 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 very wealthy, even more so than she probably already was. So now you can begin to see some similarities here, right? At the beginning story with Samson and his wife, and this end story here with Samson and Delilah. If you remember way back when Samson first got married and he had his 30 companions there, or 30 friends, how did they eventually figure out the answer to the riddle? Who did they attack? His wife, right? That they came to the lady that was involved with Samson and used her as a crutch against Samson to figure out whatever it is they're trying to figure out. So there's a lot of similarities here. Sin short circuits your common sense, right? Sin can short circuit your common sense, right? It causes things to go haywire. Really simple example of this. At my house, I've got a garden, right? And there's plenty of deer always trying to get in and eat my garden, okay? And I've done a variety of things to kind of keep them out. Got a fence up, got a dog, just all these different remedies you can find. This year I decided I'm going to put an electric fence up as well. So I've got my regular fence. Let's put an electric fence up around the outside of it. That way when it hits that deer's nose, boom, it scares it away and maybe it won't come back. It's been very effective. Had no deer in the garden this year. But as I was putting the electric fence up, right, and you put it up in tiers. Electricity's kind of like water, right? It flows in one direction. You got to figure out where how to get things connected and in the circuits and all the things that you need. What I found was that no matter how often I weed eated around the bottom of my electric fence, one really small blade of grass, right? A lot of times even that I couldn't see, one very small blade of grass that I may have missed while I was weed eating, if it was touching that electric fence anywhere, what's going to happen to the electric fence? It's going to ground out, right? It's going to ground out and not work. And I could be as very careful as I wanted to, be very conscientious about making sure I weeded it all the way around it. But it seemed like every time I did that, it didn't matter. I have at least one place where I had a blade of grass or missed a spot that was causing the whole thing, right? This whole ornate electric fence, one little problem causes that whole thing to short circuit and to ground out and not work. Exact same thing with sin, right? While we may think this is really not that big of a deal, okay, I can handle this situation, or I can kind of hang on to this sin because it's not really affecting anything, and maybe you kind of enjoy it, or that's kind of just something that you're used to, or a habit, or whatever it is. The problem with that sin is that it's still laying on that electric fence, right? It's still causing that barrier. In our sense here, this spiritual barrier, it's still causing that thing to ground out. And that's what sin will do. Even small little things that we kind of hang on to, it completely short circuits, it grounds out our common sense barrier that the Holy Spirit gives us. That's what's happened to Samson here. In his case, his ground, right, the thing that was causing him was his attraction to this female, right, or this lust that he had for these women, right? His first wife and then Delilah later on. And sin will always cause common sense to short circuit. Samson should have been alert, right? He was in the middle of enemy territory. He was involved with an enemy woman. The last time he was involved with an enemy woman, 30 of what he thought were his friends attacked her to figure out the riddle so they could do him harm in some way. He should have been on high alert, but he was not. Sin had allowed his common sense to short circuit, and it caused him to relax his guard. That then brings us to verses 6 all the way down through verse number 20, in which we now begin to see the divisiveness of Delilah as well. Okay? Samson was wrong for being involved with Delilah, but Delilah is no saint herself either, right? And as we read down through verse 20, we will see that. And we will begin to see how persistent she was trying to learn the source of Samson's strength. Now, on one hand, we think Delilah, that old goodness, right? An old hag shouldn't have been acting like that and doing that to Samson. She shouldn't have been. But on the other side of this, you've got to think she's getting ready to be 5,500 pieces of silver more rich if she figures out the answer to this riddle. Okay? So while we can maybe blame Delilah a little bit because she shouldn't have been doing this to Samson, we also can't blame Delilah because she's not an Israelite. She doesn't know God. She's serving pagan gods and whatever. She's more self-serving and by her nature. So it makes sense why she is so persistent, because she's due a huge payday here. She can figure this thing out. Let's get to verse number 6 and let's just see how persistent Delilah is. And Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee." Okay, so she just comes right out and asks him, "Hey, why are you so strong? What makes you so strong?" And you can see how this is going, right? She's maybe rubbing on his head or got her arms around his neck, and she's loving on him a little bit. You know, she's probably got the perfume on, all the things you can imagine is taking place. She's trying to make herself as attractive as possible, trying to make his guard come down as much as possible, so she can figure out the story. And she asked him, right, what makes you so strong? And we see his first response, verse 7. And Samson said unto her, "If they bind me with 7 green withs that were never dried, then shall I be weak and be as another man." Now, I think there's something very interesting here that takes place in verse number 7. Okay, we look in verse 6, and Delilah asks Samson what's the question that she asked, and put it in our terms. What makes you so strong, right? That's all she asks him. What is it that makes you so strong? And you get to verse number 7, and you can see Samson knows something's up. Right? Look at verse number 7. And Samson said unto her, what pronoun is used there? If they. Right? He doesn't look at Delilah and say, "You know what, honey, if you put 7 cords around me, then you will see that I'm just like any other man." No, that's not what he says, right? He says, if they. He is fully aware, I think, that Delilah is asking him this for the Philistines. I think he knows that, right? I think just in that response, he says, "You get those old boys to come in here and wrap me up 7 cords, and I'm going to be just like any other man." He knows good and well what's about to happen. Okay? What should have Samson's response been? He should have got out of there, right? He should have got out of there, not giving her any answers at all, not worried about what she looked like, what she was wearing, how enticing she was being, how she smelled. It shouldn't have mattered. He should have got his hind end out of there, but he didn't. Okay? Because Samson, again, we've seen this now, he has an eye problem. He thinks that he knows best. He thinks that he can be able to get out of any situation. And this is now our 4th week looking at Samson, and what have we never seen Samson do? Walk away or pray. We've never seen him ask God for anything, right? We've never seen him go to God in any form or fashion for any type of advice. It's always Samson knows best. Okay, so Samson's aware why Delilah is asking him this and exactly what is about to take place. So he tells her, if they bind me with 7 green withs, 7 cords, that's what this would have been, that were never dried, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withs, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now, there were men lying in wait outside. No. Where were they at? They were in a stinking bedroom with her, right? They were in the bedroom. Samson, this is not just one man. This is men. This is multiple people here that are in the bedroom with Samson and Delilah, lying await as she is tying him up. They were abiding with her in the chamber, and she said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson, and he brake the withs as a thread of towel is broken when it touches the fire, so his strength was not known. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack here. Right? Samson obviously is there seeing Delilah. Either she talks him in to tying him up. Either he's fallen asleep and she ties him up. There's no specifics of what takes place, but we know that he's there and he's tied with these 7 cords. Okay? Now, I know most representations of this is that Samson's been there for a while. He falls asleep. She lets the Philistines come into the bedroom to kind of lay wait for him to lose his strength. They bring the cords. She ties him up and wraps these things around him. They're all there waiting, and then she kind of goes over and screams and wakes him up. Now, that could very easily have happened. Okay? I don't think that was necessarily the case, though. Now, this is 100% Alanciism, okay? This is just my interpretation of this. I think the old boys are in the bedroom to start with. Matter of fact, I think Samson came walking in and was probably looking and pointing at him like, I got you suckers, right? I think they were there, lying wait, and he knew that. And he laid there and let her tie him up. And then once he was done, she screams, hey, you saw a couple of them, there's more here. There's a lot of Philistines here. And he just pops those things like it's no big deal. Okay? I think Samson was well aware of what was going on. I say that because we've seen his answer now. He knows Delilah is working with the Philistines. I just don't think the old boy cares. And I think he's trying to just entice them and anger them anymore because he thinks that he's invincible and he can do anything that he wants to. Okay? So we see the first instance here now. They're in there. Another reason that I think that, like if Samson wakes up, right, and there's all these men in the bedroom with Delilah, you just think the response would have been, hey, what's going on here? I have these guys in the bedroom when I'm not here, right? There's a whole bunch of other responses that could have taken. I think he was fully aware of everything that was going on. I think he knew they were in there. I think he sat down, she tied him up, and he just laid and waited for however long, maybe 2 more, whatever the case may be. But I think he knew what was going on. This did not surprise him in any way. But, as we saw, he had lied, obviously, to Delilah and to the other Philistines, and we see that he breaks through the first set of the first challenge here, the first cord, first 7 cords that he was given. Samson here is toying with sin. Right? He is walking down that line and occasionally jumping over it and kind of toying with it and towing the line and flirting with disaster, but he doesn't seem to care because he thought he'd get away with anything because of his strength. Samson has failed to forget, though, that the source of his strength is from God, right? The hair is the reason he still has it, but the source of the strength is from God. And he has forgotten about that, and he thought that he could literally get away with anything. His immorality has dulled his perspective. Right? His immorality has dulled his perspective. He has completely lost sight of the fact that God is the reason that he is able to do anything and everything at all. Verse number 10. 10. And Delilah said unto Samson, Behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If thou bind me fast with new ropes that were never occupied, then shall I be weak and be as another man. And Delilah therefore took new ropes and bound him therewith, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liars in a wait, and hiding in the chamber, and he brake them off of his arms like a thread. So we see another instance of the exact same thing happening, right? So if Samson didn't know that the Philistines were in the bedroom the first time that Delilah tied him up, he definitely had to have known that they were there the second time, right? Because now there's a pattern here of things taking place. This is why I, again, think Samson is fully aware of what's going on the entire time. He's just too arrogant and doesn't care. He doesn't need anything about it, okay? So they go through this whole event the second time. This time use new rope, never been used before. You tie me up, I'll lose my strength. She does exactly as he's told. Again, he probably is looking from the same corners the same old voice came from the first time. She screams, Philistines are on you, and he busts those ropes out again, just like he did the last time, and they broke off like a thread. Okay? He should have seen through Delilah's design and through Delilah's lies. But we see Samson coming back for more, right? He just continues to come for more and more and more until finally he's going to give in. Verse 13. For the third time now, Delilah said to Samson, Hitherto thou hast mocked me, and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, And thou weavest 7 locks of my head with the web. And she fastened it with the pin, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee. And this time he waked out of his sleep, and went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. So he asked now a third time, and now he's getting a little closer to the truth, right? He's getting a little bit closer to the first time. It was just some rope. The second time it was a little stronger rope. Then getting a little closer to the truth this time. And he says, If you take and braid 7 locks of my hair with the web, and fasten it with the pin. Now this time, obviously, as she is braiding his hair, I would assume, he obviously at this point sometimes falls asleep. Okay? This is another reason why I think Samson is fully aware of everything going on. This is the first time we've seen Scripture say that he actually woke up, okay, waking up. So I'm sure in the midst of playing with his hair, braiding his hair, he got super comfortable and fell asleep. Moxie, when she's ready to go to bed, she reaches up and grabs Haley's hair, and she starts to twist it, and then eventually she starts twisting her own hair, and before you know it, she's got a full-on knot in her hair, but she's fast asleep, right? So when I was watching Moxie do this, this makes sense why Samson fell asleep here. He got really comfortable, and you know, he fell asleep. So she braids his hair, fastens it with a pin, tells him again this time, Samson thereupon, that he wakes up out of his sleep, and we see verse 14, went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. So for the third time now, he has lied to her once again. This lie a little closer to the truth, but still hasn't told her. And then we get to verse 15. Okay, and this is now the 4th time. So we've seen Delilah being super persistent here. She pleads with him and pressures him here for the 14th time, or the 4th time, and he now finally breaks in and tells the truth. Now, what is Samson displaying here by staying with and continuing to come back someone who is actively trying to kill him? Yeah, stupidity, right? His total lack of focus on God. We've said that, right? Sin will make you lose your common sense, right? Immorality will change your perspective. Samson's perspective is totally changed. He has completely lost, not that he really had much anyways, but he's lost total focus on God whatsoever. And we see it now more than ever, because although Samson's made some really poor decisions, we never see him cutting his hair, right? We never see him kind of deluging that secret that that's what causes him he now gets to a point where he has totally forgotten about God altogether. Because it doesn't make any sense, right? If you know the one thing that's keeping your strength is your hair, why would you tell somebody that's what is keeping you strong, right? It shows us where off Samson is here in a mental capacity. He thinks the hair has nothing to do with his strength. He can't, right? Because if he did, then he wouldn't have told her. So he has totally lost focus and understands that he has no concept at all right here that God is the one that's in control of things. He honestly thinks it's 100% him. Verse 15, and she said unto him, this is a classic one, right? You don't really love me. If you love me, you tell me the truth, right? Classic stuff here, okay? And that's what she does. If thou really... And when she said unto him, how canst thou say I love thee when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lieth. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, and urged him, so that his soul was vexed unto death. Now, I love my wife more than anything. But when she wants something done, especially around the house, and she needs me to do it, she becomes a bulldog, okay? And she'll stay on me until I get it done. Now, when we first got married, I used to say to her, hey, there's Lance's time and there's Haley's time, right? Haley wants things done on Haley's time. Lance will do the things that Haley wants, but we'll do it on Lance's time. After 6 years now, I think it's just a lot easier if I just go do it on Haley's time, right? Because she can just continue to kind of be a little bit of a, so certain things, here and there, a little bit of a bulldog, right? And that's okay, because sometimes Lance needs a little direction because he'll start 1,000 things and not finish any of them, okay? We see here that even though Haley can be a bit of a bulldog, nothing like Delilah, right? Because I've never felt like, if I don't do this, I'd rather just die. Like, I've never got to that point. That's where Samson's at here, right? It says that. She pressed him daily. She was nagging him every day, over and over and over, until the point that his soul was vexed unto death. Okay? And there's one thing to be a bit of a nag, okay? And sometimes, I'm not complaining. I'm not saying that that's bad. I need that sometimes, right? I'm bad about forgetting to take the trash out. I am. I don't do it on purpose. I just forget. And then I usually hear, hey, got the girls. Had to take trash off today. Kind of stares at me for a second, because that's your job, but I had to do that, right? But it's never been to the point where I've wanted to die, okay? That's where Samson is at. It has vexed him. She's been on him and nagged him so much that he would rather die than have to hear this woman talk anymore. So finally, he told her, verse 17, all his heart, and said unto her, there hath not come a razor upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God. Go back and check the whole story of Samson is the first time we see him referencing God at all. From my mother's womb, if I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. This is the one part of this story I just simply cannot understand. Okay? Everything else going on here, I get. Right? I kind of get it. Samson is just absolutely love-struck on Delilah. She's the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. He's not really telling her what's going on. He's so strong. He's never failed at anything his entire life. He's always been able to do any physical feat that he's needed to do. I can fully begin to understand why Samson is the way that he is. But this part of the story completely and entirely blows my mind. What is Samson's one defining characteristic? His strength, right? And that strength that comes from his hair. That God told him he would have as long as he didn't cut it. The one thing that has made Samson famous, and obviously being famous is really important to Samson. We see him doing all this stuff. The one thing that makes him famous is that hair, because it gives him his strength. And for whatever reason, right, her vexing him unto death, him just maybe tired of the whole thing, or him just completely thinking that, I don't know, God wouldn't actually get rid of his strength. I don't know. I can't wrap my mind around this because of the things that Samson says. Right? We don't see his train of thought. We don't see him saying, well, I'll still have my strength. I'll just tell her to cut it. No, he actually tells her that. I've been a Nazarite, verse 17, from unto God from my mother's womb. And if you shave my head, I will be weak and become just like any other man. I don't know why, but he finally tells her the entire truth, and he gives in unto her pleading, and of course, as we're going to see here, pays the price for divulging his secret. Verse 18, when Delilah saw they told her heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. And the Philistines came unto her and brought the money in their hand, and she made him sleep upon her knee. And she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him, and the strength went from him. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee. And Samson woke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as other times before, and shake myself. And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes, and brought him down to gaze, and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. So he pays the high price here for telling the secrets. Delilah shaves his head while he asleep, and when he woke up, she tells him again, the Philistines are here. They pounced on him, and Samson's self-confidence soared so high. He shakes himself and does whatever he does normally to display his strength, but though he thought he was going to be strong and his self-confidence was at an all-time high, his strength had plummeted here to an all-time low. And Samson the mighty powerhouse became Samson the helpless. And the Philistines gouged out his eyes. They bound him with chains, threw him into an abominable prison where they forced him to grind grain like an animal would around the threshing floor. So he's taken from the fields that rightfully belonged to Israel. The grain was taken from those fields, thrown into this grinder, and he was the guy pushing the grindstone around the circle because he had lost all focus on who he was. Suppose you had the opportunity to visit Samson while he was in prison. Okay, so maybe you were there and able to go in and visit Samson while he's in prison. What would he say? What do you think he would say to you about the importance of taking God's command seriously? Right? I think we'd find a man that was truly and entirely humbled. Right? It's taken a lot. Now he's blind. He's acting like an animal, just grinding the grindstone around. And he probably would tell you how important it was to take God serious. Sometimes later, the Philistine gathered to order Dagon, which was the god who they attributed to Samson's defeat. Verse 23. Then the Lord of the Philistines gathered them together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God hath delivered Samson our enemy into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may make us sport. So they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. All right, so I'm going to finish up here, and we'll get into the rest of this next week. But they have this celebration here. 3,000 people are probably at attendance of this celebration, and they're praising their god Dagon because they think he was the one that delivered them. Delivered Samson them, and they are going to force him now to entertain them in some form or fashion, in some matter, so they can mock him in any way. So, of course, we know they bring him in, they attach him to pillars that are in the temple of Dagon or whatever it is that they are worshiping, and they're there and they're making sport of him, they're making fun of him. Of course, he can't see anything. All he can hear, we can imagine the insults and the slurs will be throwing their way. If you look back up to verse 22, right? Howbeit the hair of his head had what? Began to grow again, right? After he was shaven. And this shows you just kind of how dumb the Philistines are. Right? What's probably the one thing I would have put somebody in charge of? Hey, Samson's alive. You have to go in there every weekday, every day. Shave it, right? That's the one thing that should have happened, okay? But we see, again, Philistines, not very smart in this situation, are thinking their God was more powerful than Samson and the things that happened because of that. So we'll leave Samson right here, 3,000 people in attendance, drunk and carrying on, hollering stuff at Samson. His hair is growing back, which should have been a red flag to the Philistines. He can't see anything, and he's tied up to two really important pillars of foundational pillars that were holding a lot of weight of this building. He's there in the center, and they're all making fun of him. And we'll leave Samson right there. We'll pick him up next week. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you again for our story that we have here with Samson and being able to see the error of Samson's ways simply because of his own doing, because his inability to understand that it was nothing that he could possibly do, but everything that you were doing in him. And because of that, we see him cloudy judgment led to total blindness in his own right, Lord, and he went from physical blindness to spiritual blindness, Lord, and then we begin to see at the end of this a bit of a redemption story for Samson as he realizes once again where his strength comes from, Lord. I pray it's a reminder to us of being fully and entirely faithful and obedient to you and the consequences of being not. If nothing else, Lord, I pray that we get that from this story. And we thank you for the story of Samson, that we can study it, be able to see the lessons and truths from it as well. I pray Pastor Rob, as he comes here the next few minutes, to use him this morning. He was attentive to the word that you have to him for us as well. In your name I pray. Amen.